Hello, everyone. My name is Kathy Reyes, and I'm with San Mateo County Health, Behavioral Health and Recovery Services Community Health Promotion Unit. And we are here today with Amber Akemi Pyatt. She's with Human Impact Partners, and she'll be presenting Criminalization and Incarceration Harm Our Health. We are going to be sharing this webinar today with anyone who's interested in the topic. And the purpose, the reason for creating this webinar, it really comes out of a health equity conference that we held in spring of 2019 with our community partners, including Redwood City 2020 and other departments within the health department. We had the Office of Diversity and Equity, which is also in behavioral health, and health policy and planning were also a part of that conference. And we really explored social determinants of health, and three topics that we dove into were transportation, education, and criminal justice. And so we wanted to really bring some of the learnings from those workshops more and make them available more broadly. And so one of the ways in which we will do that is through this learning webinar today. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Amber, who will kick us off. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathy. And just want to also give a thank you to all the folks who put on the Health Equity Now conference and for all of that work in organizing both the conference and the session. So thank you. So as Kathy mentioned, my name is Amber Akemi Pyatt. I am the Health Instead of Punishment Program Director at Human Impact Partners, which we go by HIP. And I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I'm excited to talk to you all today about some of the pathways through which criminalization and incarceration harm our health. So first, for those who aren't familiar with our work, HIP is a national nonprofit organization working to transform the policies and places people need to live healthy lives. We do this by increasing the consideration of health and equity in decision-making. So through research, advocacy, and capacity building, we bring the power of public health to campaigns and movements for a just society. And we are based in Oakland, California, just up the road from San Mateo County, even though we have a national focus. So before I go too far into sort of policy and data land, I wanted to share why it is that I care about and do this work. So I got into public health to do violence prevention work. I had been working in mental health research and direct service for years down in Los Angeles, and eventually found myself just completely overwhelmed by the scale of pain and suffering in the communities I served. And even though I was working on an evidence-based program that was shown to reduce symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, it just really wasn't enough. And I wanted to move upstream to really prevent and address the root causes of violence and harm, and I did. So I dove sort of face first into public health. But then again, over my years of doing violence prevention and intervention work, I really came to see over and over again that our current systems of accountability are not set up to heal people, or even really to address harm, not for the survivors, not for victims, not for their families, or even for people who have caused harm in any given situation. So once that became clear to me, I had a lot of questions, and I guess the one I want to start us off with is this. Can we truly advance health equity, which I'll define here as everyone having a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible? Can we truly advance health equity without ending mass incarceration and over-policing? So my hope for us today is to lean into that question, sit with it, dig into it, and hopefully have some ideas of how to begin to address it. So our agenda for today will be, first, I'll review some national and local facts. Then we will look at health impacts and racial inequities at different junctures in the criminal justice system. Then we'll highlight solutions and share ideas for further reading and how to stay in touch. And I'll just acknowledge at the get-go that this is a body of work that people spend their entire lives on. This is work that has been going on for generations, so I certainly have no illusion that we will cover everything in the span of an hour or less. But hopefully this will just be a bit of a teaser and give people a flavor for what to think about. Okay. So national data on incarceration. There are 2.2 million adults who are currently serving time in a prison or jail in this country. There are also more than 45,000 young people, youth, who are confined in juvenile detention facilities, in adult prisons, or in adult jails currently. There are 4.7 million people who are currently being supervised in the community by a parole or probation agency. There are 2.7 million children who are currently growing up with one or both of their parents in a prison or jail. And on top of that, we have approximately 10 million children who at some point in their lives have experienced parental incarceration. And given what we know of research on ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, this has serious consequences for people's life trajectories, which I'll touch on more a bit later. Black people are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white people. And this is a really important statistic that I want to unpack just a little bit. We know that Black people, Black communities are disproportionately and equitably incarcerated and targeted by our systems of criminalization and incarceration. And a scholar that I really look up to, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, really cautions us not to over-associate Black people with incarceration. And so one thing also to put here is that within the 2.2 million adults who are currently serving time in prison or jail, that actually looks like about a third Black, a third white, and a third Latinx. So there is a disproportionate representation, but they do not make up a majority of who is incarcerated today. Next, the number of people who are incarcerated has increased every year from 1980 to 2008. And that shifted after 2008, which is really great, and thanks to a lot of the attention that's been put on this issue. The financial side, in 2012 alone, the United States spent nearly $81 billion, that is with a B, on corrections. And this fact always makes me think about many people, including Martin Luther King Jr., who remind us that our budgets are moral documents. And this fact should really give us pause and make us think about what are we communicating about our values as a country by spending $81 billion on confining people inside of a prison or jail. And finally, both the number of people incarcerated and the incarceration rate in this country exceed every other nation in the world. This is one place where the United States absolutely takes the cake and leads in the world. So all of this is to say, it is called mass incarceration for a reason. Now, that's the national picture. On a local level, in San Mateo County, the most recent data I was able to find was for 2016 when I was preparing for the Health Equity Now conference in the spring. So I wanted to bring some of this up. And of course, folks who are listening to this will have other facts that feel really important. So maybe we can think about ways to continue the conversation and be able to bring some of that into the fold as well. But one thing to lift up is that San Mateo County jailed 129 per 100,000 adults ages 18 to 69, and this is lower than the state rate of 227 per 100,000 adults, which is good. We want to see lower rates. But 69% of the daily jail population in the county was unsentenced, which means they are presumed innocent until proven guilty. 69% of people inside of jail are legally presumed innocent. And this is a higher percentage than the state percentage of 66%. So that's not great. We should be working to get both of those numbers way, way down. Next, San Mateo County had a 369 per 100,000 youth, ages 10 to 17 for juvenile felony arrest rate. This is lower than state rate of 478 per 100,000 youth. So again, that's good. We want those numbers to be lower. And finally, there were 117 per 100,000 youth aged 10 to 17 held in local juvenile halls and camps. And this is higher than the state rate of 106 per 100,000 youth. So obviously these are 4 stats. This won't capture the full breadth of all of the both issues and successes of San Mateo County, but I think gives us a little bit of a picture of what's going on. And I think what I would say is it's mixed, right? There are places for improvement. I think one of the great things about living in a place like San Mateo County is a commitment to equity, to justice, to serving communities. And so I think we should all be striving to figure out how to do better. And this maybe just gives some ideas on where that might happen. And we'll talk more in particular about the juvenile justice system a bit later too. Okay, so now I'm going to give us a little flavor of how health and equity show up in the different parts of the criminal justice system. This will be very overgeneralized. This will make the process look more linear than it actually is, and it's not at all meant to be a deep dive, but hopefully this will prompt questions and reflections for you, and we can explore those another time. So I'm going to walk through that now. So first, in the sort of first juncture in the criminal justice system, we're going to talk about law enforcement contacts and arrests. So, and all of this is based on research. I didn't want to present any anecdotal stories here. I wanted us to be grounded in what we know about health impacts and racial inequities. So first, there was a study done that showed that there is an association between deaths among Black people due to legal intervention, i.e. due to law enforcement, and subsequent poor mental health among Black adults living in that whole same state. So I think what this brings up for me is an acknowledgement that these aren't individual people experiencing individual things or even individual families. These are news like law enforcement violence, news like mass incarceration. These are deeply traumatic experiences that actually impact full communities and full societies. So that was one, and we know that through this particular study. I should note that at the end of this presentation, I have a reference list. So all of the superscript numbers that you see are associated with the citation for this. So that will be available at the end if you'd like to read the full studies. Next, and I think this is particularly important for San Mateo County to be considering, as well as other places, but I know this has been a very live conversation in San Mateo County. So we know that there have been at least 1,081 deaths after the use of tasers since the weapon became sort of widespread in its use in the early 2000s. So I think this is a major caution to think about how we understand and proliferate non-lethal options when tasers is often touted as a non-lethal or less lethal option than guns, but it has been associated with a number of deaths, including in San Mateo County, and I know this is something that we're really thinking about and would encourage us all to think about de-escalation strategies rather than using weapons that we actually know are quite lethal. So next, the next juncture I want to look at is the whole process through which prosecutors or district attorneys file charges or don't file charges and secure plea deals with clients and constituents. So one is, we know that white defendants are 25% more likely than Black defendants to have their principal initial charge dropped or reduced to a lesser crime. This is really important in part because one of the things that really applies pressure onto people to accept plea deals is really threatening and high-level initial charges. So this, and then of course those plea deals often include jail or prison time. So that is a very important fact that demonstrates a lot of structural racism being embedded within our systems, and the need to explicitly correct for that. We can't just cross our fingers and hope that structural racism goes away. We actually need to put policies in place to make sure that there's accountability to not performing racism in our systems and structures. Next is, there was a study done that showed, and in that study, 35% of the women who were surveyed experienced homelessness, eviction, or the inability to pay rent or mortgage on time as a result of a loved one's bail, court fees, or related missed economic opportunities. And this I just want to make explicit. We know that housing is a major social determinant of health, especially in a market like the Bay Area. And knowing this and knowing the impacts that then that homelessness, eviction, or inability to pay rent or mortgage on time has on one's health is really tremendous and worth attention. Okay. So next is around pretrial detention. Obviously, there's a lot going on in our state right now after the passage of bail reform and the ensuing bail industry ballot referendum. So this is also a very live conversation, and different localities are having different approaches on how to deal with this, given different contingency plans on the state level. And I think it's important for us to really pay attention to, especially given that we know that San Mateo County has a higher rate or higher percentage of its daily jail population being held unsentenced than the rest of the state. So this should be a particularly important thing to look at for the county. So in California, this is a shocking statistic. In California, nearly 80% of people who die in jail have not been convicted of their current charges, which is a higher percent nationally. So really important to think about how sort of questions around how might we better handle, better support people rather than incarcerating them without having been convicted of any charge. What would it look like to support people in different systems and in different ways? And also pointing to racial inequities, you know, that Black people have greater odds of pretrial detention and are given higher bail amounts than white people with similar charges and criminal histories. So one thing that I was just learning about is in San Mateo County, that there is a really small population of Black people in the county. And so one thing that I would be curious about, and perhaps some organizations or agencies, government agencies are already looking at this, is, and as I understand it, there are more Latinx, there's a higher Latinx representation inside of San Mateo County jails. So I'd be curious to know if there's been any analysis done of whether Latinx people in the county have greater odds of pretrial detention and whether or not their bail amounts for similar charges and criminal histories are set at comparable amounts. That would be a question to dig into if it hasn't been looked at. Okay. So with trials, and again, most people don't ever go to trial. Often charges are dropped or plea deals are taken. But in the event that cases do go to trial, I wanted to highlight some of the ways that young people are particularly vulnerable in that. So when youth are tried in trial in an adult criminal court, they typically face a longer court process than in juvenile court and are often detained during this really lengthy period. So I think there is, of course, a question within there of whether young people should be moving through a criminal justice system. I think there's a general question on whether and how our criminal justice system works for people. But even with that, there's a separation of adult criminal court and juvenile courts, and there have been specific protections put in place within the juvenile courts in acknowledgement of the ways that young people are vulnerable, both in brain development and in the impact of having a touch point with carceral systems so early in their life trajectory. So this is one piece. Also that the stress of navigating the adult criminal court system that is put on youth who are transferred, this put them at particular risk for psychiatric disorders and other developmental problems. Adolescence is a really critical human development window, and I think we should be having some serious questions about how the impact of being put through a trial, being put through incarceration really impacts people's entire life trajectory. Okay, so this one I will say, it was hard to pick. I didn't want to overwhelm people. It was hard to pick two sort of studies or facts to really highlight that I thought were really illustrative of some of the particular problems at a given juncture. There is a growing body of work and evidence around the health impacts of incarceration. I'll highlight some of those in the further reading section at the end of this presentation. It was really hard to pick just two things to highlight for this slide. And my desire to have this be of similar format on each slide meant that I did keep it to just two, but I just want to acknowledge that there's actually quite a bit of work being done to document the health impacts of incarceration. So one that I think is just incredibly straightforward and important to remember is that each year one spends in prison corresponds with a 2-year reduction in life expectancy. So if we think of years of life lost, this is just a health crisis. If you think of replacing years spent in prison with any other sort of condition of life, this would be a huge, huge groundbreaking, all things stop, what are we doing here type fact, right? Like if each year, or if each whatever, scoop of ice cream corresponded with a 2-year reduction in life expectancy, like we would have a serious intervention on ice cream, right? But I have serious questions about why the health community has not yet mobilized as profoundly as I think is necessary for the scale of this problem to address this fact that is on the slide right now. So, and then I alluded to this earlier, this is also an entire body of work, but wanted to highlight here that parental incarceration in childhood is considered one of the validated adverse childhood experiences. And these, what are called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, predict a wide range of health problems during young adulthood. And those include poor self-rated health, HIV and AIDS, asthma, high cholesterol, migraine, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and anxiety. This is a huge, huge, huge problem. There's a dose-response relationship between the number of adverse childhood experiences a young person has and how they're going to be dealing with these various health problems over the course of their life. So, and again, as I was on the first slide, there are 10 million children for whom this is true, for whom they had parental incarceration. So, massive problem. Okay. Finally, I want to talk about probation and parole. There's a lot that could be done here. Often a lot of parole and probation policies are set at the county level. There's a lot of room for improvement and an eye toward health equity in these spaces. So, one, again, this connection between health or housing as a social determinant of health and how incarceration and criminalization impact housing. So, parolees in one study averaged 2.6 moves per year, which is far beyond the more than one move per year, which defines residential instability. And residential instability is associated with a number of health impacts and health conditions. So, and also just logistically, I mean, think about that. 2.6 moves per year. Can you imagine? I mean, and maybe some of the people, I don't mean to assume that people here have not experienced that, but 2.6 moves per year. How do you hold, like, the number of things that then impact on your employment, on being able to comply with your parole requirements? What does it mean if you have to move outside of the radius in which you're allowed to exist? What if your kid's school then moves? Are you able to go and pick your kid up from school? Are you able to attend extracurricular activities. This impacts a number of things and is particularly important for people who are trying to do their best to comply with parole requirements as well. Next, in one study that actually HIP helped lead in Wisconsin, we found that although only 18% of Wisconsinites, people in Wisconsin, suffer from mental illness, 44% of people who were revoked, which I'll talk about in a second, which is imprisoned without a new conviction, are living with a mental illness in part because of living in fear at all times that revocation could happen at any time. So this was part of a larger research study we did on an issue of crimeless revocations, which is where someone is out on parole and have a number of technical requirements as part of their parole. So things like a curfew, things like staying within a certain radius of their home, things like, etc. And when people violate those technical requirements, so say they're out, their curfew is at 8 p.m. and they decide they need to go to their child's theater performance at 9 p.m., that is a violation of their parole. They can be reincarcerated for violating the terms of their parole. It is not a crime to go to your kid's theater performance at 9 p.m., but it is a violation of your parole if you're required to be home by 8 o'clock and stay home until 7 a.m. the next day. So that's what this issue of crimeless revocations is, and we think that's a place that's really ripe for policy change and making sure that people aren't being reincarcerated simply for living their life in a way that doesn't perfectly align with what any strict parole requirements might be.
Okay. Amber, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Is revocation the same thing as a violation, like a probation violation?
Yeah, but revocation specifically is when someone gets reincarcerated for that violation. Versus like you can violate, if you violate, you get a warning, for example. Or you violate and then your parole officer asks you, hey, what are you having a hard time with here? Maybe we can change this requirement given that this isn't really working for the life that you need to live to reintegrate back into your community and into your family. So revoke specifically means reincarcerated.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So this is sort of what we just went over, right? So these different junctures, again, overgeneralization of the criminal justice system. I think I wanted to highlight that there are some common threads throughout this. One is that it is very expensive to be criminalized and incarcerated. So the economic costs here show up in a number of different ways. One is the cost, for example, of phone calls when you are incarcerated to stay connected with your loved ones, family, support system, the people who are going to help you succeed when you get out and help you make it through a very difficult situation of incarceration. Those phone calls can be very, very expensive. Some parole and probation requirements require you to actually pay for things like an ankle monitor or electronic monitoring. So all of these things are very, very, very expensive, which is, of course, ironic given that we know that often a lot of the things that are criminalized are actually a criminalization of poverty. So one thing to highlight is just it's expensive. It is expensive to be criminalized and incarcerated. Another is throughout this whole process, once you've been criminalized, once you've been incarcerated, you suddenly are under a microscope. Your life, every movement you make is going to be hyper scrutinized. You don't get to exist in the world moving about your business with some degree of privacy if you, for example, do have an ankle monitor that's going to track your every single move. I think about like every single day, each of us are probably doing something that's criminalized, be it something as innocuous as jaywalking or something else, right? And the difference is who is being surveilled, who's being targeted, who's moved, who's not given flexibility to make human mistakes, and who isn't given that same grace. And finally, there are a number of barriers that are put up in place throughout the process, right? So I think about, for example, some jails won't let you have a visitor who has a criminal conviction on their record. So what happens if you are really struggling inside while you're incarcerated and you have a loved one who wants to come visit you, but they have a criminal conviction, and suddenly you're not going to be able to access that person that's going to help you succeed, help you survive. So there are a number of barriers put in place, and I'll talk a little bit in the solutions portion about some of the barriers that we can remove to make sure that people, as they reintegrate back into society after being incarcerated, that they're able to live as full and healthy of a life as possible. Okay. And I also wanted to acknowledge that even all of this, there are many interconnected systems, this is plural, of criminalization and punishment. So one place we see this is in what is popularly called the school-to-prison pipeline. We see things like school resource officers, which is law enforcement presence inside of schools, and there are places that have cops inside of the school and don't have any counselors. So again, this gets back to this question of how do we invest our resources? What does that communicate about our values? And I don't think schools should be sites of criminalization and punishment. But nonetheless, that is the situation we are in. And then this is really important. There's a very strong connection and at times direct collaboration between immigration enforcement and local law enforcement. And, we've passed a number of really important policies in California, including SB 54, which is a sanctuary state policy to ensure that we're limiting that collaboration between immigration enforcement and our criminal justice system. And I think and yet there's still more work to do. I know I do work in Alameda County quite a bit, and one thing that we are trying to get clear on is making sure that there are standard policies and procedures for when people are released, so that ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement, isn't coming and picking people up who don't have citizenship from our jails when they're released, essentially handing off people from a criminal justice jail into an immigration jail or prison. So there are ways that people who don't have citizenship are sitting at the crossroads of two rather terrifying systems, and we need to make sure that that's not happening, and might be something of particular interest to San Mateo County, given the high representation of Latinx people inside of the jails. So, actually, one more thing I'll say on this, and I'll come to this also with record expungements, is it's also important, even like in our understanding of the problem, to look at that intersection, but also in our understanding of the solutions too, right? Because people who are having to interact with ICE are going to have unique requirements and needs put on them than people who aren't interacting with ICE. And so we want to make sure that when we're passing reforms, when we're moving forward toward making our society look more just, that we are explicitly and intentionally looking at ways to make sure that there aren't unintended harms and consequences for our immigrant communities. Okay, so here's my thesis. All of this, we call this our criminal justice system. I think language is really important, and all of this suggests to me that there isn't actually all that much justice in our criminal justice system. So, something to think about there. And from there, where do we go? So I want to highlight a few promising solutions or approaches, and I want to start with decriminalization. So I remember in my graduate program in public health, one of the things we talked about was related to reproductive health, sexual health. And we talked about different approaches when HIV/AIDS and awareness of HIV/AIDS was really coming to be. And many states tried criminalizing, making it a crime to not disclose your HIV status to a sexual partner. And, maybe that was well-intentioned, but what we actually found happened is that when you criminalized that, people stopped getting tested. Why? Because you can't disclose your HIV status if you don't know your HIV status. So it was essentially the only way to guarantee you could never be criminalized, because otherwise it was a matter of different testimonies on what happened inside of a given room within a given conversation, and there was no way to really prove that you did or did not disclose your HIV status. So people stopped getting tested, which also meant people stopped getting treatment. So if we actually care about health, we know that criminalizing things does not facilitate people having open conversations with their health providers. It doesn't facilitate people getting more information, and it furthers stigma. Criminalization increases stigma. Stigma is not good for health either. So that is sort of a more classic public health example. And I also want to, and I want to tie that to thinking about sort of pushes to decriminalize and or legalize marijuana. So we know in some places that they have downgraded the crime of having or using marijuana to a lower level offense, and that evidence shows does not work. So, what we see is when you just downgrade crimes related to marijuana to lower level offenses, the marijuana-related arrest rates will remain stable or even increase. And this is, I should say, particularly for possession, when possession is reclassified as a lesser offense, but is still considered against the law. So this does nothing to change contact with law enforcement. Versus in Massachusetts, for example, courts ruled to limit police enforcement of marijuana possession and arrest bail by 86%. So again, when you decriminalize drug use, it not only reduces arrest and incarceration, but it also has the public health benefit of increasing uptake of drug treatment with cost savings, because you're redirecting resources from the criminal justice system to health systems. So, which will tie some to the invest-divest solutions that I'll talk about in a second. But before I move, I want to challenge us for a minute to think about our current approaches to handling violence. As I mentioned at the top of this, violence prevention and intervention is really my life's work. It is what brought me to public health, and I believe that criminalizing violence actually isn't helping us do anything to help people who do commit acts of violence learn different behaviors. We know that a number of violent crimes, including sexual violence, are some of the lowest reported crimes. And I think what that opens up for me is questions around, what happens when calling law enforcement is your only form of accountability? People aren't opting into that. So what does that leave as gaps for allowing people to heal, allowing people to heal not only themselves, but the relationship, if it's someone that they're still in relationship with, including if it's a family member, community member. And I really think that it's great to be having conversations about decriminalizing things like marijuana, which we know have no lethal consequences. But I want to expand us, and I want to have us think a little bit about how it is that we even conceptualize violence and why criminal approaches seem to be the ones that we primarily, if not exclusively, take. Okay. So next, I want to talk about closing facilities. So this is particularly relevant for the juvenile justice system in California. And I think one of the things that advocates and activists say a lot is that if you build it, you will fill it. So by having these facilities, there is a financial draw to make sure that you are using that facility to its full capacity, and there's a really high cost to maintaining open facilities. So in cases where we have really been able to decarcerate and really reduce the jail or prison population, I really think it's important to then accompany that with closing and demolishing facilities to make sure that there isn't an incentive to fill that physical space. So, and of course, part of that too is I put the like if and when you decarcerate as a given. I also think, of course, we need to really focus on decarcerating, which is connected to things like decriminalization. So I want to talk for a minute about the juvenile justice system. So between 1999 and 2015, the number of incarcerated youth in the country, in the United States, declined by more than 50%, which is great. And between 2006 and 2016, there were 98 youth facilities that were closed in California. Also great. This is about a 40% facility reduction. So this was due, again, to decarceration related to decreasing youth arrests, changes in sentencing policy, changes in the culture surrounding youth justice, and really concerted efforts by advocates, organizers, and directly impacted people, really applying pressure to their targets, decision makers, to make that change. So we are seeing continued decreases in county level juvenile hall populations and youth camps, which is grounds for further closures. So we see this showing up, for example, in San Francisco. San Francisco officials voted to close the city's juvenile hall by the end of 2021. I would argue it might be able to happen sooner, and I would hope it would happen sooner. But at the very least, that is a commitment that San Francisco has made, and I think is well worth San Mateo County and other places considering as well. So, and again, this is just like a little bit of a flavor. I think if this is an issue that feels particularly interesting, one resource I would direct folks toward is a recently released report that Impact Justice put out. It's called Nothing Good Happens in There, Closing and Repurposing Youth Detention Facilities in California. So that's a good in-depth place to look for more resources. Okay. Invest, divest. So invest, divest as a strategy, again, begs us to think about how our budgets, if and how our budgets reflect our values, and if not, to divest money from systems, structures that do not reflect our values, and instead invest in ones that do. I think this also points to thinking about evidence-based strategy, and really thinking about what people need to be able to live healthy lives, to be able to live with safety in their community, and to be able to thrive in community with one another. So one thing that really kind of sits at this intersection quite well that is important, and this is federal, but the Pell Grant program, which for folks who don't know, is a federal needs-based grant for college education. Since 1994, people who are imprisoned have been denied eligibility to Pell Grants and other similar state assistance. And this is particularly troubling because a study of prison education actually shows that for every dollar you invest in prison education, you save $4 to $5 on the back end on reincarceration costs. So for those who receive college education in prison, this really can improve employment prospects, reunion with families, self-assessment, and recidivism outcomes. And so reinstating eligibility to Pell Grants or other tuition assistance programs that don't have to come through the federal government, could be a county decision, would really allow for people who are incarcerated to improve their life trajectories, and would really, I think, better align with a lot of the values that I know we in the Bay Area hold. Okay. On barriers, there's been a lot of really exciting momentum nationally and in California to really restore voting rights and think about the ways that our democracy is really under siege right now. And it's a moment for us to really reevaluate who is included in our democracy and how people get to participate. So one thing that I'm feeling really excited about is there is a constitutional amendment that is being considered in the California legislature right now, ACA 6, and that would restore voting rights to every person on parole in California. So if that passes the California legislature, then it would go to voters on the ballot, given that it's a constitutional amendment, and I think would really shift the electorate in the state. So that's one thing. There also, of course, are a number of ban the box efforts that are always ongoing and is a place where both public and private institutions can look at their own internal practices related to hiring and other things, access to services, access to programs within the county. When and how do people ask for their criminal histories? And I would also say always being careful about data collection on people's citizenship status, documentation status, even if it's collected by an agency that we know and trust. Once that data is there, it's vulnerable to being subpoenaed and taken by other agencies as well. So always asking the question of like, do we need this data and why? And if not, can we take these questions away? So also there have been a number of efforts to really push record expungements, both on a policy level and on a like technology innovation level. And one thing there is always to make sure that that's in any criminal record expungement programs are in conversation with and coordination with immigrant justice organizations, because for example, you might have, a program that seals people's records, which for people who have citizenship might just be great. But then if someone is having to go through ICE proceedings, it might open up questions of like, do they disclose something that's been sealed? If they do disclose, will ICE be able to access it? It creates a situation where people could be perceived to be lying or hiding things that really is just created by confusion in the interconnections between criminal systems and immigration systems. So that's something to always make sure that as we're moving forward with solutions, we are having an eye toward the ways that people are differentially impacted. Okay. And then the last sort of like solution I want to bring to us is around language. And this is something that individuals can adopt. It's also certainly something that organizations and agencies can as well. But, the process of dehumanization really begins with words. It doesn't end there, but it certainly begins there. And words, when weaponized as threats, can actually translate into acts of violence and harm. So the way that we talk about things, the way that we talk about people, the way that we talk about issues is really, really important, especially if and when they get codified into policy, capital P or lowercase p policy. So one thing that I always try to do is put the person first. So I don't use the terms like inmate, prisoner. It's always people who are incarcerated, people who were incarcerated, people who are on the inside, people who, whatever it is. And I know this happens with a lot of other things, like with mental health, for example, like you try to stay away from like mentally ill people, like people who struggle with schizophrenia, people who struggle with, people who have depression, if you start with people, it really centers someone's humanity and also acknowledges that many of the identities and experiences and states that each of us moves through in our lifetime or even in a given day aren't permanent. So someone who is incarcerated, that is not all that they are, and it's not all they ever will be. So if you put that as a sort of phrase that is attached to people, it allows for the centrality of their humanity to come through first. Another is framing. And for me, it's really important to always acknowledge how the social determinants of health, how structural oppression, how structural racism impact people's lives, right? So if you just look at like a snapshot of someone's Thursday afternoon, you're not going to get a whole picture of, they are struggling with 3 part-time jobs, none of which give them regular hours, and they just lost their house because the mortgage was under their parents' name who just passed away, and they're really just trying to raise their family. And so yeah, they wrote one bad check because they didn't know when their next paycheck was coming, and their hours kept getting cut from 2 of the jobs. Yeah, and like that's what they needed to do to make sure they could get food on the table for their kid, diapers for the kid, whatever it was, right? That tells a very different story than saying so-and-so wrote a bad check, they stole money. Like how different do those two things feel? How important is it to make sure that we're always including as much context on someone's living conditions, circumstances, environment as possible to really explain some of what went into a given person's decision. And then I also think, like, with language and narrative and framing and communications, there's a way too that just, like, the realities of 2019, like, things are rough, and there isn't all that much space to have imagination on what our world could look like. Like, what would a world where we have achieved health equity actually look like? What would it look like to live in a place, in a world, in a society that doesn't cage people? And I think this isn't just sort of like the hopeless optimist in me, right? I think there actually is incredible power in always putting in the room, putting on the table our vision for what our world could look like, and putting into our collective imaginations what we're actually pushing for. Because also, if we don't have a vision for what we're trying to get to, like, what's the point of pushing so hard, right? Like, all of us are working really, really hard. Like, why not just go lay on a beach if we don't actually have a vision for what world we're actually pushing for, right? So I think that's always important to keep in the conversation as well. And, you know, narrative is a large project. Changing narrative is a long-term game. And we at HIP had, with a work group of the National Criminal Justice and Public Health Alliance, which HIP facilitated, put together a toolkit for this. It's called Developing a Transformational Criminal Justice Narrative. And that is it's more of a process document to explain to folks how you go about building a transformational narrative with a group of people that you're working with. So that's a resource that's available on our website. Okay. So with that, I just want to review some of what I think are the key takeaways from today. Obviously, there's a lot more to go into with each of these, but these are sort of 4 things that I'm really thinking about, and I hope that today helped other people think about as well. So one is that racism, classism, and other social oppressions are baked into the fabric of the United States' criminal justice system. Systems always produce perfect results for their design. If you don't like the results you're getting, you have to change the design. This is where policy change, system change is really important. 2 is that individuals do not get incarcerated alone. Families and communities do with them. And we have some research to show that. 3 is that measuring health impacts give us one way to assess the systemic harms of the criminal justice system. I'm not saying it's the only way, but it's just one way that we can really document and understand what's going on. And 4th is that those closest to the solution are always closest to the, or those closest to the problem are always closest to the solutions. And I should have said at the top that all of the promising solutions that I put forward are things that have been taught to me by people that I organize with, by thought leaders who have shared their brilliance and wisdom with us online and other mass communications. But those are all solutions that have been brought to me, and I'm so grateful that have been brought to me and to my attention by other folks. These aren't things that I came up with by any means. So with that, these are some readings that I think really uplift some of the great thinking that have informed my work and the way that I approach these things. They include a policy statement that was put out by the American Public Health Association called Addressing Law Enforcement Violence as a Public Health Issue. The Movement for Black Lives put out a policy platform which is robust and extends beyond the criminal justice system, and I think is really a roadmap for many of us that we should be using. Angela Davis is, of course, an incredible scholar, thinker, activist in this space, and has a number of writings that I think are incredibly valuable. One book is her book, Are Prisons Obsolete? Another, again, scholar, doer that I really look up to is Michelle Alexander. Her seminal work on the new Jim Crow is available, and she also has columns that are also very interesting and give her perspective on more contemporary issues that we're constantly pushing up against. HIP put out a resource called Health Solutions Create Safety, which was created with a number of community organizations and uplifts a number of approaches that local groups and groups across the country use to advance the dual and sort of mutually informed goals of promoting health and safety. And then finally, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, along with the University of California, San Francisco, put out a resource which is tremendous called Mass Incarceration Threatens Health Equity in America, and really puts forward a case quite similar to what I talked about today. I also wanted to provide this quote that I think really guides a lot of the way that I think about the world and my role in this work. It comes from an Aboriginal elder named Lila Watson, and it goes, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." I think it speaks to solidarity. So with all of that, this is my contact information and HIP's social media. You can write me, connect with us with any questions, comments, ideas for partnerships, requests for technical assistance, which we provide. I'd be happy to get that ball rolling. My last one is, as promised, my reference list. These should be easily findable, but if you have any problems with them, you have my email address as well. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amber. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Amber. The last slide there, it's a bit blurry to see. Is it possible to make it available as a PDF? Okay, thank you. And I want to thank you for all your insights and information that you've given us, really given us a lot to think about. I'm going to stop recording now.